In Nazi Germany, women were slowly stripped of their rights, and before long, many found themselves trapped inside a system designed to break them completely. From the moment they were arrested, to the horrors inside concentration camps. The brutal torture methods they faced went far beyond just punishment. At first, with Adolf Hitler rising to power in 1933, things didn't look like open terror. It started quietly. Laws were passed, rights were taken away step by step, and women, especially Jewish women, political opponents, Romani women, and later women from occupied countries, were slowly pushed out of normal life. The Nazi system was built on total control, and once they had that control, they began using violence to enforce it. Women were seen as either useful or disposable. If they were considered pure Germans, they were expected to serve the state by having children. But if they were seen as enemies, they were treated as less than human. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws had officially stripped Jewish women of citizenship. This meant they had no protection anymore, and that's when things started getting darker. Women began to disappear. Arrests became more frequent. The Gestapo had the power to take anyone without explanation. And once a woman was taken, what happened next often stayed hidden. At first, the violence was more about intimidation. But by the late 1930s, the Nazi system had moved past simple arrests and intimidation and turned into something much more organized and deadly. Camps were no longer just prisons. They were machines built to break people down physically and mentally. When Ravensbrück concentration camp opened in 1939, about 90 kilometers north of Berlin, it became the central hub for imprisoning women across the Nazi system. At first, it held German political prisoners, like communists and so-called asocial women. But as the war expanded, women from over 30 countries were sent there, including Poland, France, the Soviet Union, and the Netherlands. Life inside Ravensbrück followed a strict and brutal routine that never changed. And that was the point. Every morning before sunrise, women were forced out of their barracks for roll call, known as appel. This could last for hours, sometimes in freezing snow or pouring rain, with guards counting and recounting prisoners. If numbers didn't match, the entire group had to stand there longer. Women who were already weak from hunger often collapsed, and instead of helping them, guards beat them with sticks or rifle butts, sometimes dragging them away like they were nothing. Food was another weapon. Prisoners were given watery soup made from rotten vegetables, and a small piece of bread that had to last the whole day. Sometimes the bread was mixed with sawdust to make it stretch further. Women quickly became malnourished, their bodies shrinking, their strength fading. Starvation made them dizzy, slow, and confused, which then led to more punishment because they couldn't keep up with forced labor. Many women were assigned to work in nearby factories, including ones run by Siemens, where they built electrical parts and weapons under constant supervision. They worked long hours with almost no rest, and mistakes were punished harshly. Violence from guards was constant and unpredictable, which made it even more terrifying. Both male SS guards and female guards took part in this abuse. Some of the most feared female guards included Irma Greza and Dorothea Binz, who were known for extreme cruelty. They used whips, wooden sticks, and even trained dogs to attack prisoners. Women were beaten for things as small as not standing straight enough or looking in the wrong direction. Punishments were often done publicly so others would watch and feel the fear. The barracks themselves were overcrowded and filthy. Hundreds of women were packed into spaces meant for far fewer people. There were no proper beds, just wooden bunks stacked on top of each other, often shared by multiple prisoners. Lice and disease spread quickly, especially typhus, which killed thousands. There was almost no medical care, and sick women were often left to die unless they were selected for something worse. One of the most feared places in the camp was the punishment block. These punishment cells were small, dark, and completely isolated. Women were locked inside for days or even weeks with barely any food or water. Some cells were so cramped that prisoners couldn't lie down properly. Others were completely dark, cutting off any sense of time. The silence and isolation drove many women to the edge of madness. Then came the selections, which were one of the most terrifying parts of camp life. Guards and doctors would inspect prisoners and decide who was still fit to work and who was not. Women who were too weak, sick, or injured were marked for death. In the early years, many were shot or died from neglect. But later, especially from 1944, a gas chamber was built at Ravensbrück itself. Thousands of women were sent there in the final months of the war. Others were transported to killing centers. The decision could come at any time, and there was no way to escape it. What made Ravensbrück especially cruel was that everything was designed to strip women of their identity. Their hair was shaved, their names were replaced with numbers, personal belongings were taken away, even friendships were dangerous because anyone could disappear overnight. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, the camp became a place for something even more disturbing. The Nazi regime had fully embraced the idea of using prisoners as test subjects, and women in camps like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz concentration camp became some of the main victims. These experiments were approved by high-ranking officials and carried out by trained doctors, which made them even more disturbing. At Ravensbrück, one of the most well-known groups of victims were Polish women, who later became known as the rabbits. They were called this because they were treated like lab animals. Many of them were young, healthy, and chosen specifically because their bodies could survive longer during testing. Doctors cut open their legs without proper anesthesia and deliberately infected the wounds. They inserted bacteria like Streptococcus, along with dirt, wood splinters, and pieces of glass to recreate battlefield injuries. They then watched how the wounds reacted, testing different drugs and treatments. The pain was constant and severe. Infections spread quickly, causing swelling, fever, and sometimes gangrene. Some women had parts of their bones removed, while others had muscles cut out. Many were left permanently disabled, and several died from these procedures. Another major focus was sterilization, which tied directly into Nazi racial policies. The regime wanted to stop certain groups from having children, especially Jews, Romani people, and others they labeled as undesirable. Women were forced into sterilization experiments that were incredibly painful and often deadly. Some were exposed to high doses of radiation aimed at their reproductive organs, which caused severe burns, internal damage, and long-term suffering. Others were injected with chemicals that destroyed their ability to have children. Surgical sterilization was also performed, often without proper medical care or anesthesia, leading to infections and death in many cases. At Auschwitz, the scale of experiments was even larger. Doctors like Josef Mengele became infamous for their actions. While he is mostly known for his work on twins, women were also heavily involved in his experiments, especially in studies related to reproduction and genetics. Pregnant women were in an especially dangerous position. Many were killed immediately upon arrival, but others were kept alive temporarily so doctors could observe pregnancy under extreme conditions. Afterward, both the mother and child were often killed so their bodies could be examined. Some women were injected with unknown substances, including chemicals and diseases, just to see how their bodies would react. There was no treatment afterward. Others were forced into freezing experiments, where they were exposed to extremely low temperatures, sometimes by being placed in ice water or left outside in freezing weather. Doctors then measured how long it took for the body to shut down and what methods, if any, could bring someone back. These experiments caused extreme suffering and almost always ended in death. What makes all of this even more disturbing is how normal it was treated by the people running it. Doctors kept records, took notes, and discussed results as if they were working in a regular hospital. The victims weren't seen as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. Sexual violence in the Nazi system is one of the least talked about parts of history, but it was widespread and deeply damaging. It didn't always leave clear records, but survivor testimonies have revealed just how common it was, both inside the camps and in occupied territories. At places like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, humiliation often started the moment women arrived. They were forced to undress completely in front of guards and other prisoners during intake procedures. This was presented as a health inspection, but in reality, it was meant to strip away dignity and create a sense of total helplessness right from the start. These forced nudity inspections didn't just happen once. They were repeated regularly, often under harsh conditions, and with guards shouting or physically abusing prisoners. Women were made to feel exposed and powerless, which was exactly the goal. Over time, this constant humiliation broke down their sense of identity and self-worth. In 1942, the Nazis had introduced a system of camp brothels in several concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Women often selected from Ravensbrück were forced into sexual slavery. They were told they would receive better treatment, but in reality, they were trapped in a different kind of nightmare. They were forced to have sex with male prisoners under strict supervision, and refusal was not an option. Many of these women were already weak and sick, which made the abuse even more devastating. This system was officially organized, showing how deeply normalized exploitation had become. Outside the camps in occupied countries, sexual violence was even less controlled and often more brutal. During mass arrests, house raids, and interrogations, women were frequently assaulted by soldiers and officers. In Eastern Europe, especially during the invasion of the Soviet Union, reports of mass rape became widespread. Women of all ages were targeted, and there was almost no accountability for those responsible. The system either ignored these crimes or allowed them to continue. Pregnancy in these conditions was extremely dangerous. In the camps, pregnant women were often seen as useless and were either executed immediately or forced into abortions under horrific and unsafe conditions. Some women tried to hide their pregnancies for as long as possible, but it was almost impossible to survive. In many cases, newborn babies were killed shortly after birth, especially if they weren't considered racially acceptable. Young girls were also victims of this system. Age offered no protection. Teenagers and even younger girls faced the same risks as adult women, which shows just how far the system had gone in dehumanizing its victims. This same pattern of Nazi brutality followed in places like France in 1940 and deep into the Soviet Union after 1941. Behind the front lines, the Gestapo and the SS worked to crush any kind of resistance, and women quickly became part of that fight, whether they planned to or not. Women in resistance groups played key roles as messengers, spies, and safe house organizers, and because of that, they were seen as serious threats. In France, many women worked with underground networks, passing information to the Allies or helping downed pilots escape. One well-known example is Lucie Aubrac, who helped organize prison breaks and smuggled information right under the noses of German officers. But when women like her were caught, the consequences were severe. Arrest usually came suddenly, often in the middle of the night, followed by transport to interrogation centers, where the real nightmare began. Interrogation under the Gestapo was built around breaking a person completely. Women were taken to prisons or hid in offices, where they were isolated and questioned for days or weeks. Torture was a standard tool, not an exception. Beatings were constant, with guards using fists, batons, and whatever else they had. Electric shocks were used on sensitive parts of the body to cause maximum pain. Sleep deprivation was another method. Women were kept awake for days, sometimes forced to stand the entire time, until their bodies started to shut down. Hanging torture was also used, where a woman's hands were tied behind her back, and she was suspended by her arms, putting extreme pressure on her shoulders and often causing permanent damage. Some had their fingernails ripped out during questioning, while others were burned with cigarettes or cut with blades. The Nazis wanted fear to spread. When a woman was tortured, everyone would hear her story later. Public executions and visible punishments were used to show what would happen if anyone resisted. In occupied Poland, entire groups of women were arrested during mass sweeps. Many were executed on the spot, while others were deported to camps like Ravensbrück concentration camp, where their suffering continued under a different system. In France, thousands of women linked to the resistance were rounded up between 1942 and 1944 and sent east to camps. Many never returned. Transport itself was a form of torture. Women were packed into overcrowded train cars with no food, no toilets, and no fresh air for days. By the time they arrived, many were already sick or dying. By 1944, it was clear that Nazi Germany was losing the war. Allied forces were pushing in from the west after the D-Day landings, and the Soviet army was advancing rapidly from the east. Cities were being bombed, supply lines were breaking down, and the entire system was starting to collapse. But instead of slowing down the violence, the Nazis made things worse, especially inside the camps. Camps like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück became dangerously overcrowded as prisoners were moved from other camps to avoid liberation. Barracks that were already packed became even more cramped, with women sleeping on floors or squeezed into bunks made for far fewer people. Food shortages became extreme. Rations were cut even further, and starvation reached a point where women were too weak to stand or even speak. Then came the death marches, one of the most brutal chapters of the entire war. As Allied forces got closer, the Nazis began evacuating camps, forcing prisoners to march long distances toward other locations inside Germany. Women were driven out in the middle of winter, often without proper shoes or clothing, walking through snow and freezing temperatures. There was almost no food or water given during these marches, and guards shot anyone who couldn't keep up. Bodies were left on the side of the road. Thousands of women died this way, not in camps, but along these endless roads. Inside the camps, executions increased sharply. Gas chambers, especially at Auschwitz, were used at a faster rate as the Nazis tried to eliminate as many prisoners as possible before liberation. At Ravensbrück, a gas chamber was built late in the war, and thousands of women were killed there in just a few months. At the same time, medical experiments didn't stop. Even as the system was falling apart, doctors continued their work, carrying out procedures that had no real purpose anymore. Guards also became more violent and unpredictable. They knew the end was near, and many were trying to cover up what they'd done. Records were burned, buildings were destroyed, and in some cases, prisoners were killed simply to remove witnesses. Others were abandoned without food or care as guards fled. The structure of the camps began to break down, but the danger didn't disappear. It just became more chaotic. For the women still trapped inside, these final months were some of the worst they had ever experienced. They were already exhausted, starving, and traumatized, and now they were being pushed even further, with no idea if they would survive another day. And then, almost suddenly, after years of suffering, everything changed. Soviet troops arrived at Auschwitz in January 1945, and later, when other Allied forces reached places like Ravensbrück concentration camp, they found thousands of women still alive, but in terrible condition. Many were extremely thin, weighing far below normal. Their bodies were weak from starvation and disease, and some were too exhausted to even react to being freed. The camps themselves were filled with evidence of what had happened, Piles of bodies, abandoned barracks, and storage areas filled with personal belongings taken from prisoners showed the scale of the system. Survivors began telling their stories, and slowly, the full picture started to come together. What had been hidden behind walls and barbed wire was now out in the open. After the war ended, efforts were made to hold those responsible accountable. The most famous trials took place during the Nuremberg trials, starting in late 1945. Leading Nazi officials, doctors, and camp personnel were brought to court. Some of the doctors involved in experiments were tried in what became known as the doctor's trial. Guards from camps like Ravensbrück were also prosecuted in separate trials. People like Dorothea Binz were found guilty and executed for their crimes. But for survivors, justice in court didn't erase what they had gone through. Many women left the camps with serious health problems that lasted for the rest of their lives. Injuries from beatings, experiments, and starvation never fully healed. The psychological impact was just as heavy. Nightmares, fear, and trauma stayed with them long after the war ended. Some women chose to speak about their experiences, helping historians and investigators understand what had happened. Others stayed silent, unable or unwilling to relive those memories. What becomes clear when looking back at all of this is that none of it happened by accident. The torture, the camps, the experiments, they were all part of a system built step by step. Once the idea took hold that certain groups of people were less valuable, everything else followed in a chain that became harder and harder to stop.